Afternoon, everyone. My name's Andy McMullen. I'm a director at Broadgrove Planning and Development Limited. We are a CPM partner, having joined the network and the group about 6 months ago, and delighted to be here today to discuss recent and upcoming changes to the planning system. I'm joined by my colleague Connor Wigley, Senior Planning Consultant. Just a bit about Broadgrove before we get going. We started as a business in 2018. Myself and my business partner, Richard Walters, started the business, and we have 3 employees, soon to be 4 members of staff. We're based in Stockport, South Manchester, but provide town planning advice across England, Wales, and Scotland, from as far south as Devon up to Airdrie in Scotland. So today we're going to talk about recent changes to the planning system that have occurred in the last 6 months, proposed changes to the planning system, and then looking further into the future. This is by no means, we could spend a whole hour just talking about one of the topics that we're picking up on. So if you have any questions specifically about one of the areas that we're covering, feel free to put those in the questions in the chat, or alternatively just come and contact us directly if there's any kind of location or site specific queries that you may have. As I say, if you do have any questions, if we've got some time at the end, I'd be happy to answer them on anything that we've raised here. So just in terms of more specifically, in terms of the recent changes, we're going to look at the National Planning Policy Framework, Biodiversity Net Gain, Class MA prior approval, which is commercial to residential, Class Q, which is agricultural to residential, and then a bit about enforcement and immunity from enforcement. That's on recent changes. In terms of proposed changes, we're just going to discuss the accelerated planning system, which consultation ended yesterday. And then we're going to sum up with just looking further into the future and what the planning system may hold. So without further ado, I'm just going to pass over to my colleague, Connor, who's going to pick up on the National Planning Policy Framework.
Hi, everyone. So the highest profile recent change in planning has been to the National Planning Policy Framework, also known as the NPPF. So the NPPF was first introduced by the coalition government in 2012 in line with their localism agenda. This saw a shift from regional-based planning to a centralised document that sets out the government's overarching vision for national growth. The first revision to the NPPF was published in 2018, with 4 revisions since, but the update in December 2023 being the most significant, with many industry commentators noting the wider political landscape nationally as the main driver for the changes. So the main changes are reforms to housing delivery. So under the previous version of the NPPF, all local planning authorities, or LPAs, in England were required to continually demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply. This involved identifying an evidenced breakdown of specific sites expected to deliver housing for the next 5 years from a typical base date of the 1st of April every year. So the updated NPPF states that LPAs will not need to meet this requirement as long as their adopted local plan is less than 5 years old, and that the local plan has identified at least a 5-year supply of specific deliverable sites at the time that its examination concluded. There's also a reduced requirement for some local authorities who've got an in-progress local plan, i.e. where a local plan has been consulted on under Regulation 18 or 19, or it's been submitted for examination. If this draft local plan includes a policies map which proposes housing allocations towards meeting its housing need, those authorities will only have to demonstrate 4 years of housing land supply based on its 5-year requirements. However, this particular change only applies for 2 years from the publication date of the NPPF, which is until the 19th of December 2025. So as a result of these changes, it's estimated that 40% of local planning authorities will no longer be required to demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply. If you'd like to understand how it affects a particular local authority, just let us know after the presentation. But the changes have consequences for decision making and when the presumption in favour of sustainable development applies. So that presumption means that planning permission should be granted for sustainable development unless the application of other policies in the NPPF to protect assets, such as listed buildings or areas of particular importance, provide a clear reason for refusal, or if the adverse impacts significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits of granting planning permission. So this presumption is known in shorthand as the tilted balance, and it changes the exercise of assessment that the decision maker has to carry out. And in general terms, it increases the prospects of planning permission being granted. So this means that those authorities who no longer have to demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply will be better protected against unplanned or speculative development, typically on greenfield sites, because this tilted balance will not apply. So practically, this change provides an incentive to local planning authorities to keep their local plans up to date so that they do not continually need to demonstrate this 5-year supply. There are other changes to the assessment of housing supply. So under the previous version of the NPPF, all local planning authorities, when calculating land supply, were required to build a buffer of 5% by default, 10% or 20% into the calculations, with the aim of boosting housing delivery. In the updated NPPF, the 5% and 10% buffers have been removed, but the 20% buffer has been retained, but only where an authority's delivery of housing falls below 85% of the authority's requirement over the past 3 years. The last 3 years' delivery is calculated in the housing delivery test produced annually by government. In addition, historic oversupply of housing can now be accounted for in the housing land supply calculation, and further guidance on this is to follow. The expectation is that the removal of the 5% and the 10% buffers will simplify the 5-year housing land supply calculation for local authorities. There is a concern, however, that their removal will reduce a key incentive for local authorities to keep delivering housing supply and maintain accountability where delivery exceeds the 85% threshold. There's also greater flexibility for local authorities in assessing their local housing needs. New text has been added to the NPPF at paragraph 60, clarifying that the overall aim of local authorities in the context of delivering homes should be to meet as much of an area's identified housing need as is possible. Under paragraph 61, the revised NPPF also states that the standard method for calculating housing need to establish the number of homes required is now considered as an advisory starting point. Under the previous NPPF, the standard method was not classified in this way, and there was no similar explanatory text. So as a result of the changes, local authorities have greater flexibility to plan for fewer or higher number of homes than the standard method indicates, and where there are specific local circumstances that justify an alternative approach to assessing housing need, that is now explicitly supported. If you want to understand how this affects a particular local authority, please ask in the questions. In addition, there's now increased support for specific categories of housing. So whilst the general theme of the changes has been to limit the scope of the mechanisms that previously sought to boost housing delivery, some specific categories of housing have received additional support. One of them is retirement housing. So a new paragraph, 63, has been added into the revised NPPF, which requires local authorities to assess a local need for retirement and care housing provision. Local authorities are then required to reflect this need in their local policies. So these changes reflect specific concern identified by the government, and the NPPF makes clear that they are now prioritising sufficient housing supply for an ageing population. And in this context, the drafting has been included to support the provision of that housing explicitly. There's greater support for small sites. So at paragraph 70B, the revised NPPF requires local authorities to support, through policies and in their decision making, small sites to come forward for community-led development for housing and self-build and custom-build housing. So this reflects an objective of the government to give greater confidence to small and medium-sized builders with a view to diversifying the housing market. And finally, there's increased support for community-led development. So the revised NPPF provides that local authorities should support the development of exception sites for community-led development on sites that would otherwise not be suitable as rural exception sites. So this too reflects the government's ambition to emphasise the role of community-led development with a view to supporting locally led housing. The inclusion of express support for these categories of development should, in time, filter down to increased support for each category in local plan policies and in decision making. The next change is there's no requirement for greenbelt boundaries to be reviewed or altered through local plans. This has been one of the most controversial changes, fueling concerns about future local plans delivering less, not more housing in areas that are constrained by greenbelt. However, local plans must still be evidence-based, which provides some assurance on the matter. There's increased support for mansard extensions. So the NPPF now provides that authorities should allow mansard roof extensions on suitable properties where their external appearance harmonises with the original building. So this reform will offer the ability to enable new housing by extending upwards, as long as these extensions are in keeping with local character and context, particularly in conservation areas. And admittedly, this is one of the more niche changes to the NPPF. And finally, the energy efficiency of buildings has been focused on. So there's a new paragraph, 164, which requires local authorities in determining planning applications to give significant weight to the need to support energy efficiency and low carbon heating improvements through adaptation of buildings. So this represents strong, in principle, policy support for increasing the energy efficiency of buildings. So some concluding thoughts on the NPPF. So the primary effect of the changes will be to disapply the presumption in favour of sustainable development for a variety of local authorities by not requiring them to demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply. The absence of the tilted balance will reduce the number of planning permissions granted for residential development, which would otherwise have been granted due to the lack of housing supply. The authorities now excluded from this requirement with up-to-date local plans within the last 5 years, and those who are partway through the local plan process with significantly advanced plans. So the latter category of authorities, to remember, are only excluded temporarily for a 2-year period, enabling these authorities to finalise and adopt their updated local plans. Excluding a large number of authorities from this requirement may reduce the amount of unplanned development in those authority areas, and authorities are ultimately incentivised to retain that benefit by updating their local plans quickly. However, the NPPF in itself does not address the hurdles which authorities face in undertaking the process of updating their development plans through the lengthy process to adoption. Go on to the next slide.
Okay, next going to talk about biodiversity net gain, which I'm sure is a topic that not only have you seen in the property press, but also the national coverage as well, as it's received a lot of attention nationally as an issue. So Biodiversity Net Gain, or BNG, was introduced by the Environment Act in 2021. It is an approach to planning and development that aims to ensure development leaves the natural environment in a measurably better state than it was before. BNG requirements should enhance and create natural habitats and help towards building the resilience of wildlife and its ability to adapt to climate change. So from the 12th of February this year, it is mandatory for all Town and Country Planning Application Act developments granted permission to provide a minimum of 10% net gain in biodiversity, measured against pre-development figures. From that date, local authorities, from the date of the 12th of February, can set local plans to seek additional biodiversity net gains above the national minimum of 10%. Currently, there are a few examples of LPAs stipulating a 20% uplift in biodiversity. However, this is not commonplace. Biodiversity uplift can be achieved through habitat creation or enhancement on site and/or off-site, or through the purchase of statutory biodiversity credits from the government. The mitigation hierarchy for BNG is set out in national policy, and developers are encouraged to follow these steps in order to: number one, avoid or reduce biodiversity impacts through site selection and development layout. Number two, enhance and restore biodiversity on site. Number three, create or enhance off-site habitats either on the developer's own land or by purchasing biodiversity units. And number four, as a last resort, to prevent undue delays, purchase statutory biodiversity credits from the UK government if they can demonstrate that they're unable to achieve biodiversity net gain through on-site or off-site measures. So in terms of the practicalities, BNG units will be legally secured either through a Section 106 agreement or conservation covenant. Where credits are bought from the government, the council would disclose a mandatory BNG contribution fee per biodiversity unit upon issuing planning permission, which would fund net gain provision elsewhere. While local authorities will be able to sell biodiversity units, developers can also negotiate to purchase credits from local landowners or other developers with an excess of biodiversity units. So the biodiversity position can have, obviously it's an impact on developers, but it's also an opportunity we found from landowners as well to compensate for that biodiversity impact. So initial estimates from the Department of Environmental, Food and Rural Affairs place biodiversity units at anywhere between £9,000 and £15,000 per unit, though current comparables are in excess of double this figure. And we've put on the slide there just some of our recent experiences of the cost per credit. And you can see there's a significant difference. And this is just some of the authorities across the country. And also it very much depends on what habitat you are replacing in terms of what that cost is. So any biodiversity enhancement used to achieve a biodiversity net gain will need to be maintained for a minimum period of 30 years. And this is obviously important. In terms of the practicalities of submitting an application, guidance states that all planning applications submitted after the 12th of February 2024 will need to be accompanied by biodiversity net gain information, including the pre-development baseline value measured against the most recent DEFRA biodiversity metric, the proposed approach to enhancing on-site, and any proposed off-site biodiversity enhancements that have been planned or arranged. The BNG requirements will be framed as a pre-commencement condition, meaning that the biodiversity gain plan must be approved by the local authority, allowing for the condition to be discharged before development can begin. Now, there are some exemptions to the requirements, and these are developments that are below the threshold. This will only happen in a very small number of cases. So this is development that does not impact a priority habitat and impacts less than 25 square meters of habitat or 5 linear meters of habitat. Existing sealed surfaces such as tarmac or buildings are assigned a 0 score in the statutory biodiversity metric, meaning that these surfaces are effectively exempt from the 10% net gain requirement. The next exemption is householder applications, and the final exemption is small-scale self-build and custom-build applications, up to 9 dwellings with a site area of no larger than half a hectare. In summary on BNG, this is the hottest topic around in planning at the moment, and one that local authorities are still finding their feet on. While some local authorities have had a BNG policy for maybe a couple of years now, now that it is really kicked in as a mandatory requirement, we'll see, particularly for the first couple of years, I think we're going to find a real disparity across the country as to how councils are addressing the issue. And it's particularly pertinent given the council's intention, so the government's intention to speed up the planning system and how these will interact with each other. Okay, so that's concluding on BNG. I'll just move on to the next slide.
So another recent change has been to some of the permitted development rights in the country. So One that has been changed quite significantly is Class MA, which allows for the change of use from use Class E to residential, utilising permitted development rights and without the need for a formal planning application. The prior approval of the local planning authority is needed first and does allow a council to assess some relevant planning matters, although this scope is much narrower than a planning application. The prior approval process also circumnavigates requirements for Section 106 contributions and affordable housing. It does, however, have a few limitations and conditions. So this change of use is for any building in the following uses. So shops, financial and professional services, restaurants and cafes, offices, light industrial, medical or health services, creches, day nurseries, indoor sports, or indeed anything in use Class E. There were some key changes implemented effective from the 5th of March 2024, and they are as follows. So there's now no limit to the floor space that can be converted under Class MA compared to 1,500 square metres previously, and there is no requirement for the building to be vacant for 3 months prior to an application being made. So these changes are intended to qualify more buildings under Class MA and in quicker timescales. Other matters to address and demonstrate are still applicable from the original legislation. As a reminder, these are, so the date stamp for commercial conversion, this is now a 2-year rolling period. So a building must have been in one of the uses mentioned or other Class E uses for at least 2 years. So for example, if you were to make an application today, it must have been in a qualifying use on the 2nd of May 2022 and so on. There are certain areas where you can't use Class MA. They are on Article 2.3 lands, so areas of outstanding national beauty, national parks, World Heritage Sites, so on. Sites of special scientific interest, safety hazard zones, military explosives area, listed buildings or scheduled monuments. But you can do it in a conservation area, despite this heritage designation. However, if you're intending to convert the ground floor, then an impact assessment will be undertaken. So assuming none of the restrictions above affect you, then the local authority's scope of what they can assess the application against is limited to transport and highways, contamination, flood risk, noise impact from commercial premises nearby, natural light in all habitable rooms, and if the conversion may affect a business area or similar area that the local authority considers to be important. And also to consider if the existing use is a registered nursery or healthcare, then an impact assessment will also take place on those services. So the application under Class MA has a time limit, like several other prior approvals, where the LPA has to respond within 56 days. And if you don't get a response, then it's granted. But once granted, you have 3 years from the date of the prior approval to carry out and, importantly, complete the works. So unlike a conventional planning application, where there may be a 3-year requirement to start the works and then that protects the permission, you actually have to complete within 3 years under the prior approval regs. And in terms of your fees for enabling the application to be submitted, it's £100 per dwelling under Class MA. Also to consider, now that the floor space requirements of the cap has gone, so larger buildings will be eligible, is the height of the building. So if you've got a building that's higher than 18 metres, ignoring any plants and machinery on the roof, or it contains more than 7 stories above ground, then you'll need a fire safety report. And there's some other final matters to consider, such as if there's an Article 4 direction impacting the building or in the area where the building is located, which removes the permitted development rights under Class MA. So this is in general more prevalent in larger city centres or in areas with a limited supply of office space, for example, and the local authority wants to protect these. Another matter to consider is that you can't make external alterations to a building under Class MA, and any external alterations would require a separate planning application. So, for example, this could be where you need a new window to meet the natural light requirements in all habitable rooms. So you would have to run that concurrently with the Class MA process. So in summary, the removal of the floor space limit is hugely significant, as from our experience, This was limiting the scope to use this route. The changes may also lead councils to either review or introduce new Article 4 directions, as the changes open up the opportunity for more buildings to benefit from this route. And these are just a few things to think of if you're thinking of progressing with any commercial to residential conversions. So just moving on. So moving on to another permitted development right, but this one is not so focused on town centres and commercial areas. This one's very much focused on a rural setting, and Class Q, which permits the conversion of barns and agricultural buildings to residential. Now, this is a very, very recent change as of Monday. The changes aren't effective yet, but they'll take effect from the 21st of May, and thereafter, any applications will be subject to the new rules. So the main difference coming from the changes is that the number of dwellings that can be converted in agricultural buildings is doubling from 5 to 10. And the amount of space you can convert within the buildings has increased to 1,000 square metres, again, doubling from 500 square metres. However, the maximum size of any dwelling now is 150 square metres, which is significantly reduced from the previous cap on large dwellings of 465 square metres. But in order to achieve 10 new dwellings under Class Q, each one will need to be 100 square metres each. Another change is that you can now extend to the rear of the agricultural building by up to 4 metres on any hard surface which was present on or before the 24th of July 2023, or if it didn't exist on that date, has existed for at least 10 years. So the 10-year clock in this permitted development right has always been important, and it was formally March 2013, but that has reset. So if your barn existed on or before the 24th of July 2023, and you have not taken advantage of other agricultural permitted development rights to build that barn, that's Class A for new barns or Class B for extending barns, you can now apply for Class Q. If you did build the barn under those permitted development rights, you will need to wait for 10 years before you can undertake a Class Q conversion. Should the barn have existed on or before the 24th of July 2023 and was at that time part of an agricultural unit, yet since that date has ceased to be part of the agricultural unit and been used for non-agricultural purposes, or simply been left empty for 10 years, you can also apply for Class Q. So this allows for barns that have ceased to be part of the agricultural unit to apply, which was formerly a requirement. So the important factor here is that the barn must have been part of the agricultural unit on the 24th of July 2023, irrespective of the use. So this means that some barns which were refused planning for not being in continuous use for agriculture until now could now qualify under Class Q. If you are looking to add an extension to the barn, as I mentioned, you're allowed 4 metres, but it must be on hard standing, and the hard standing must have existed since the 24th of July 2023. And to note, any extensions can only be a single story. So the biggest factor and advantage for owners of barns is that far more barns now qualify under Class Q, including barns that are no longer used for agricultural purposes. So just to recap on the basics of the class in general, aside from the changes. So there are a few limitations, as one would expect. Probably one of the most important is that you can't create 10 dwellings in one barn and then 10 in the barn next door. This would only be acceptable if the barns were on different agricultural holdings. Simply dividing the land into separate titles isn't going to work either. You could, however, create 5 dwellings in one barn, 3 dwellings in another barn, and 2 in a third, as it would respect the overall limit of 10. However, given the need for exactly 100 square metres of convertible space per dwelling, achieving 10 dwellings is likely to be difficult. If you need to put any services on the outside of the building, these can't protrude more than 0.2 of a metre beyond the existing structure. You can also extend by the same limit for any other works, such as Velux windows in the roof, for example. The legislation clearly states that external walls can be installed, allowing for the conversion of barns or units that are currently open to the elements on one or more sides. The existing building must be, in structural terms, already be capable of functioning as a dwelling. So this means the building as it stands must be capable of conversion. If it requires such substantial building operations, then what is proposed amounts to be the construction of a new building and does not qualify under Class Q. So it's prudent to obtain structural information as a starting point in this process. As with Class MA, there are a few locations where you can't enjoy Class Q. So they are listed buildings or their curtilage, conservation areas, areas of outstanding natural beauty, the national parks, the Broads, World Heritage Sites. You also need to avoid sites of scientific interest, safety hazard areas, or a military explosives area. And you can't convert agricultural units on a site that contains a scheduled monument. As with Class MA, the local authority has scope to consider the Class Q against some criteria. They are the highways impacts of the development, the noise impacts of the development, contamination risks, flood risks, the design and external appearance of the building, and importantly, the location or siting of the building and whether it makes it impractical or undesirable for the building to change from an agricultural unit to a C3 residential unit. So the guidance on this makes it clear what is known as the location test should only be used very specifically to prevent, for example, new dwellings in extremely remote locations in the countryside or close to potentially harmful activities in the countryside. And finally, the requirement, the building being converted must have a suitable access to the existing public highway. And that's Class Q. I'll pass over to Andy.
Okay, the next topic I'd like to talk about is the 4-year, 10-year rule and the immunity from enforcement action. So this is another very recent change. So the legislation prior to the 25th of April this year was such that development would be immune from enforcement action in the following circumstances. So 2 scenarios. There was the 4-year rule, and this was for the carrying out of building, engineering, mining, or other operations. And then the second circumstance with the 4-year rule was the change of use of any building to use as a single dwelling house. And then before 25th of April, we had the 10-year rule, and this was essentially any other developments, including change of use and breach of conditions. So the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act in 2023 received royal assent on the 26th of October 23, with secondary legislation finalised on the 2nd of April 2024, bringing enforcement provisions into force. So Section 115 of the Act revoked the 4-year time limit for enforcement actions, extending it to 10 years for all breaches of planning control. This applies to all operational developments and any change of use of a building to a single dwelling house. So as I say, this came into force just a week ago, but there are transitional provisions that means that this change will not apply in the following circumstances. Number 1, where the operational development was substantially completed before the 25th of April 2024. So obviously there's that interpretation and a slight grey area there as to what is considered to be substantially complete, or where the change of use to a dwelling occurred before the 25th of April 2024. So provided one of these 2 criteria can be met, then the 4-year rule would remain in those circumstances. So in summary regarding this change, whilst the change has simplified the much debated 4-year, 10-year rule, this amendment makes it much more arduous to demonstrate immunity from enforcement action simply because of the length of time that you have to demonstrate. And obviously it's not just 10 years, it's 10 years of continuous use or operational development. So I'm going to pass you over now. So that's the kind of conclusion on the recent changes to the planning system that have come into effect that you need to be aware of, I guess, if they're applicable to you in the last 6 months. And now we're going to discuss proposed changes that are likely to come in the future.
So, as we mentioned earlier, this consultation closed as recently as yesterday, and it was titled An Accelerated Planning System. So the UK government has identified that planning for development, especially in the delivery of housing and jobs, is a barrier to investment and is therefore committed to reforming the inefficiencies within the current system. In the 2024 spring budget, there was an announcement to boost capacity in the planning system, and the government is committing £3 million to match industry-led funding for a skills and education programme in an effort to attract more people to take up roles as local authority planners. AI technologies to help planning authorities streamline their local plan development processes will also be piloted, expected to produce plans in around 30 months rather than the current average of 7 years. In a speech entitled Falling Back in Love with the Future, the Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, Michael Gove, set out the government's expectation that all LPAs must have an up-to-date local plan, and planning decisions must be taken on time and should be robust in their reasoning. So the key measures outlined in the consultation included the following. The first was quicker timescales for decision making. So all LPAs will be required to offer an accelerated planning service for major commercial applications. The applicant would pay a higher fee to the local planning authority, which, in exchange, will be required to determine these applications within 10 weeks, rather than the current 13-week statutory time limit, with a guarantee that the fee paid would be refunded if the application is not determined within this timescale. So government are currently exploring two options for the detailed design of the service. Under the first proposal, this would be a discretionary option. So applicants could choose to use the accelerated service where their application meets the qualifying criteria, or they could use the existing standard application route for a major development with a lower fee and longer timescales. A second mandatory option could be that the accelerated planning service is the only available application route for all applications in a given development category. So this would have the benefit of clarity and certainty for applicants and LPAs, but it would remove the element of choice for the applicant and leave them subject to paying a higher fee. For both the discretionary and mandatory options, some common features would result. So it's proposed that the accelerated service would apply in the first instance to applications for major commercial developments which create 1,000 square metres or more of new or additional employment floor space. So this would include offices, storage and warehousing, retail, general industry, research and development, light industry, and advanced manufacturing. So for some context, LPAs determined a total of 1,640 such applications in the year to September 23, an average of around 5 per local authority. And mixed-use developments, if they met the floor space criteria, would also be eligible to use the advanced service. So it's proposed that the accelerated planning service would not apply to some applications, such as those that are screened as environmental impact assessment development, given that the current EIA regs focus on larger developments and place further duties and requirements on applicants and LPAs with a longer timescale for determining applications. However, developments which have been screened out of EIA prior to application would be eligible to use the accelerated service. Some other exclusions from the accelerated process would be applications which are subject to habitat regulations assessments within the curtilage or area of listed buildings and other designated heritage assets, scheduled monuments and World Heritage sites, as they require special considerations. For retrospective development, as the regularisation of unauthorised development should not be prioritised, and also for minerals and waste developments, given the different arrangements for these types of applications. The service would apply to Section 73 and 73B applications, which seek to vary existing planning permissions for relevant commercial developments, but we'll discuss this further later. The government recognised that to meet the accelerated timescale of 10 weeks without leading to more refusals, it is crucial that the applications submitted are of a good quality and supported with the right information. So research and engagement with the sector over the last decade has continually highlighted the most common causes for delays with these types of major development applications as being inadequate or missing information requirements and the time taken to agree and finalise any Section 106 agreements. So to ensure this occurs, government proposed that LPAs should offer a clear pre-application service to potential applicants so they can discuss their proposals, key issues, information requirements and other issues such as EIA screening, and they strongly encourage applicants to use these services. It's not proposed to mandate the use or content of the pre-app service, but it will be encouraged for all parties to engage in it. Many authorities already offer a pre-application service, which will be adaptable for the accelerated planning service and to reflect the local circumstances. The consultation also states that prior to submitting an application, applicants should notify key statutory consultees, which are likely to be engaged, that they are making an application under the accelerated service. It is acknowledged that the determination of some planning applications can be held up by continued discussions with specific statutory consultees on matters which are outside the control of the local planning authority. So the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities has already begun an independent review into the role of statutory consultees in the planning application process, and this will make recommendations about how their performance can be improved. So the government will look to use its oversight of statutory consultees to prioritise applications under the accelerated planning service and to monitor their performance too. Another proposal is related to the planning fees. So to cover the additional resourcing costs, it is proposed to set a premium fee for an application through the accelerated planning service. So planning fees are currently set centrally by government and cannot exceed the cost in providing that service. So in order to maintain a fair and consistent approach to fee setting for statutory services, the method of fee calculation would continue to be set centrally and not by local authorities. So government proposed that the premium fee should be set as a flat fee uplift, which would be a percentage of the normal planning application fee. The applicant would there pay the normal fee plus the uplift. The accelerated planning service would represent a new statutory planning application route. So given the premium fee and the firm timescales for decision, government consider that planning performance agreements for these applications should not be necessary. Where an applicant chooses to agree a bespoke planning performance agreement programme, they wouldn't be able to benefit from the accelerated service. It's also proposed that an applicant or the LPA would still have the ability to propose an extension of time of that to the 10-week term of the application. For instance, if there is a small outstanding matter which could be readily resolved to make the application acceptable. But such an extension of time should be an exception and limited in its timescale. But an extension of time would not affect any potential refunds under the fee guarantee. So the fee guarantee is something that the government are proposing that either all or a proportion of the statutory application fee paid must be refunded by the local planning authority to the applicant if the application is not determined within the 10-week timescale, even if the extension of time has been agreed. So this refund policy differs from the existing planning guarantee, where a refund is not provided if the parties agree an extension of time. This matter is still under consideration by the government of how they're going to proportion the amount of refund agreed. So moving on to extension of times and the way that they are used compared to existing. So an extension of time agreement is a mechanism by which an applicant can agree with the LPA an extended time period to determine when a planning application should be determined beyond the statutory time limit. So currently, if an application is determined within an agreed extension of time period, it is determined to be in time and does not count against the overall performance of a local authority in their decision making. So the proposal is such that in order to address the concerns about the current high use of extension of time agreements, government propose introducing a new performance measure for the speed of decision making for the proportion of applications that are determined within the statutory time limit only. usually 8 or 13 weeks. So the assessment period for the speed of decision making, the government currently assessed the performance for the speed of decision making across a 24-month assessment period. So to ensure that both improvement and underperformance are identified effectively and at an earlier stage, they propose that the performance for speed of decision making should be assessed across a 12-month assessment period. Performance in relation to the quality of decision making is measured by the proportion of decisions that are allowed at appeal. So the number of relevant cases that are going through appeal compared to determined locally is lower than that for the speed of decision making. And if this was to be measured over 12 months as well, it would represent too few cases to provide an accurate measure of performance. It's therefore proposed that this assessment period for the quality of decision making is going to remain the same of 24 months. So there is also proposals to remove the ability to use extension time agreements for householder applications and for repeat agreements on the same application for other application types. So this is to focus on efficiency as well. And because the nature of householder applications are much smaller, the government essentially saying that they shouldn't be using extension of time agreements anyway. There's also proposals to simplify the planning appeal route via the written representation method. So the introduction of expedited written representation procedures in 2013 has already provided a simplified process for determining some less complex appeals by removing the opportunity for the main parties and other interested parties to provide additional information at the appeal stage. So the government are proposing to establish a simplified process for more developments, which mirrors the existing expedited process for the following appeals. So that would be for full planning permission or reserved matters, listed building consent, works to protected trees, lawful development certificates, variation or removal of condition, details reserved by a condition, the imposition of conditions on approvals, modifications or discharge of planning legal agreements, hedgerow regulations, and antisocial high hedges. So similarly to the existing householder and commercial accelerated service, it is proposed that appeals determined through the simplified route would be based on the appellant's brief appeal statement, plus the original planning application document, and any comments made by consultees or neighbours at the application stage. There'd be no opportunity for the appellant to submit additional evidence, to amend the proposal, for additional comments to be made from interested parties, or for the main appeal parties to comment on each other's representations during the process. And it's proposed that all existing time limits for actually lodging an appeal would remain unchanged. Moving on to other future changes.
Okay, so just picking up on future changes as referenced in the consultation document, this is changes to existing permissions and overlapping permissions as well. So just recap on the current position. This is on the basis that you have your existing permission, but you want to make amendments to that permission without having to apply for the whole application again. And what are your options? So the current arrangements are threefold. So the first is a non-material amendment application, also called a Section 96A application. And this allows a local planning authority to make a non-material change to an existing planning application. In deciding whether a change is material, a local planning authority may have regard to the effect of the change, together with previous changes made under this section, on the planning permission as originally granted. In allowing a non-material change, an authority may impose new conditions and remove or alter existing conditions. So there is no statutory definition of what a non-material amendment constitutes, and there is little guidance as to what types of amendments qualify for determination under this statutory provision. It is up to the discretion of the local planning authority to decide whether or not the amendment being applied for qualifies as non-material. It is also not possible to appeal against a local planning authority's decision not to treat an amendment as a non-material amendment other than by taking an application for judicial review. The second one is a minor material amendment to a planning permission. So an LPA has an enhanced statutory powers to approve minor material amendments to a planning permission under Section 73 of the Act through the variation or removal of one or more conditions attached to the planning permission. If the minor material amendment is approved, this takes effect as a brand new planning permission for the amended development with the required conditions varied or removed. An amended planning permission under Section 73A can be subject to a new or further conditions to those already set out in the original planning permission. Again, there is no statutory definition of what constitutes minor material, although it is important to understand that a Section 73 amendment application can only be used to vary or remove a planning condition. It cannot be used to vary the time limits for implementation. And importantly, it also does not allow for the change to the description of the development. And this is important because I'll come on to the change that is being proposed. And the final amendment is actually for listed building consents. So Section 19 allows variation or discharge of conditions as long as the proposed variation to the approved drawings falls within the meaning of the written description. An application under Section 19 can be made if the applicant has an interest in the building which simply seeks a change in conditions without reopening the entire question of whether the consent should have been granted originally. So the proposed changes, among the proposals in the document is a suggestion to implement an amendment to the section, to the relevant section of the 1990 Act to provide more detail on the government's proposal to broaden the ability of developers to vary planning permissions and the treatment of overlapping positions. So as a result, the government legislated under Section 110 of the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act for a new route called Section 73B. This provides a new process for amending the description of development once permission has been granted. According to the consultation, the new Section 73B route will enable an applicant to make an application to a local planning authority for a new planning permission for development, which is not substantially different to that permission, to that granted by the existing permission. The government say it will be a new route will provide a new way of dealing with changes to a specific phase of a large-scale development granted through outline planning permission in many cases. It would help to ensure that there are effective, proportionate and transparent routes to managing post-permission changes to a development. The local authority would not be able to grant permission for a Section 73B application if it was substantially different from the existing permission. I think that the key here is with the Section 73B is it does allow for changes to the description, which were often a difficulty under Section 73A. But what it terms as substantially different, this will clearly be open to interpretation, discussion, and debate with local planning authorities. So practically, the government say this would mean that a developer would be able to make an application for development which could vary both the descriptor and the conditions of an existing permission, providing it's not substantially different. So in terms of overlapping permissions, with determination of Section 73B applications limited to the consideration of variation between the original permission and the proposed changes, utilising this route to prevent reconsideration of the merits of the whole scheme, and if approved, would result in a new permission, allowing the remainder of the scheme to be lawfully developed in a way. However, this route is constrained by the substantially different test, so it would not be available in all cases. So another option that the government are consulting on is the creation of a framework through a new general development order to grant permission, planning permission for specific development or for a class of development. Limited detail is given about this option at this stage, but essentially what they're trying to do is where the change it could be considered substantially different. And this is for large scale, often multi-phase developments. It will allow that type of application under a new general development order to come forward and to be inserted without affecting the rest of the development. So that was the consultation on the accelerated planning system, and I guess just looking further into the future on changes to the planning system. In terms of those measures which Connor and I have discussed, I guess it's based on a few different factors, really. That some or all of the measures being adopted, and secondly, obviously the Conservatives staying in power later on this year. So I guess if that doesn't transpire and we get a Labour government, then what are the likely changes to be? So there was some bold measures set out within the accelerated planning system consultation. So will all of these measures be taken forward in full or in part? Will, if they have been implemented by them, which I think is probably by Labour coming into power, which I think is unlikely, will they, but if they have, will they be revoked in full or in part? And then I guess it's just moving on to, aside from the accelerated planning system, if Labour does come into government later on this year or early next year, what are their intentions? The only kind of to the planning system, and the only kind of snippets of information we've had for them, which has received quite a bit of press coverage, is the introduction of a grey belt. I mean, which is an amendment to the current provisions under Greenbelt policy. And obviously, Greenbelt policy is highly topical, highly controversial, and is something that the Conservative government, in terms of development in the Greenbelt, have gradually sought to reduce and restrict over the years since they've been in power. But in terms of what the Labour government say for their intentions for the grey belt, so they've said first of all there'll be a brownfield first within the green belt, and any brownfield land must be prioritised for development. The second is that the introduction of a grey belt. So this is not necessarily brownfield land within the green belt; it's poor quality, and as they describe it, ugly areas of the green belt should be prioritised over nature-rich, environmentally valuable land in the green belt. At present, beyond the existing brownfield category, the system doesn't differentiate between the two. So this category will be distinct from brownfield with a wider definition. They've also pledged that affordable homes, if we're releasing land from the green belt, then there'll be a requirement of 50% affordable housing delivery on sites that do come forward. There's a commitment to boost public services and infrastructure. Plans must boost public services and local infrastructure, for instance, more schools, nursery places, new health centres, and to facilitate GP appointments. And the final thing is Labour has ruled out building on genuine nature spots, and as it describes them, and requires plans to include improvements to existing green spaces, making them accessible to the public with new woodland, parks and playing fields, and plans should meet the highest environmental standards. So that's kind of part of the manifesto stroke commitments that Labour are giving if they do come into power later this year or early next year. So I think that concludes almost exactly an hour. I see there have been some questions during in the chat room during our presentation. If there are anything specifically that you have any questions or any follow-up questions after this, then please don't hesitate to get in contact with Connor and I, either by email or by phone. I hope you found this useful. Thanks for listening, and Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much.
Thanks for your time.